Muslims in the seventh grade. And it goes back to some of the investigative reports we did many, many years ago, in which we found oftentimes that in some of the curriculum, young people were being encouraged to actually believe false things about Islam, encouraged to actually take on a Muslim name, to say the Shahada and a number of other things. And this was something that was of great concern, and it was the first chapter in his book, Public Education Against America. Well, we want to come back to that in a little bit different way, because there is a report that I think you're going to want to get a copy of. It's a report looking at the Middle East curricula. It focuses on one particular school area, and that is Newton, Massachusetts, but you can get a sense of what is happening elsewhere by watching what we are going to be talking about today on our live broadcast, as well as listening and, most importantly, reading a little bit later some of the material that we'll be making available to you. The individual that put this together is on the phone with us. Dr. Ellen Wald is the Executive Director of Verity Educate, which is a nonprofit organization helping inform parents and community leaders about the educational content of the material that are in the public schools. She is a historian with specialties in Middle East, has also been an experienced secondary school educator, and has been affiliated with such institutions as Boston University, Cambridge University in the UK, University of Georgia, and others. Teaches Middle East history at Jacksonville University. Dr. Wald, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Let's, if we can, for just a minute, give everybody a little bit of a background. How did you come to begin to evaluate all of these resources that we are going to make available to some of our listeners?
Sure. So we were, Verity Educate as an organization exists to have scholars analyze educational material for factual inaccuracy and objectivity. And our scholars are able to analyze the material line by line and explain what's incorrect and also provide evidence. And so, we were approached by parents and community members in this town to examine educational materials from their public high schools. And this is a little bit of a different project for us because typically we tend to mostly concentrate on textbooks. But in this case, a lot of the educational material did not come from textbooks, but was compiled from various sources.
Well, and I think... Yes, and I might also point out real quickly, I'll let you finish your sentence, that you weren't exactly given those resources. You had to actually figure out ways to obtain them from some of the students, correct?
Yes. Part of the problem was that these school systems were not forthcoming in providing all of the materials, partially because in this particular school system, teachers have a lot of leeway in what educational materials they bring to class, and that can have benefits, and also there can be negatives to that. So parents and community members acquired a variety of educational materials, handouts, chapters from books, etc., assignments from various students in different classes, and then provided that information to us. And then we had our scholars analyze it. But like you said, part of the problem was also determining where these materials came from, because they often came without any citations or locations. So
Sure.
We not only had to analyze the material, but also to find out where they came from.
As we go through this, ladies and gentlemen, I certainly want to pass on some lessons that we can learn. One of those actually precedes this conversation, and that goes back to the book by Marlon Maddox, because we did a number of interviews way back when we actually developed the material that became part of one of the chapters there, Becoming Muslims in the Seventh Grade. And the individual that we interviewed was Liz Lemming. And interestingly enough, she was a teacher at the school, but did not know what other teachers were teaching at the school. And so it illustrates, I think, a point that sort of surfaces here with Dr. Wald, and that is sometimes the universities, sometimes the high schools, sometimes the middle schools aren't real free to give out the information. And so you may think you know what your children are learning, you need to ask some questions. And we found then that some of the fellow teachers did not know what was being taught in some of the classrooms. And I think it's at least instructive that you did not see that the school district was forthcoming to some of those resources. But as long as young people have access to them and can bring some of them home or take pictures of it, it gave you a chance to actually look at what was being taught about the Middle East. And I think it's fair to say that what you found is that sometimes you had inaccurate information, sometimes very false information, sometimes you had, as you alluded to a minute ago, improper citations or academic dishonesty. You had some statements that were obviously very biased, and as a result, you were, I think, before we get into the specifics, somewhat concerned about what you found as the Middle East curriculum in that particular school district.
We were. The sheer number of factual inaccuracies was very disturbing to us, particularly because from an educational standpoint, learning facts about history that are incorrect really inhibits the development of a student's fluency with the material and basically with the entire discipline of history. And that also has long-term effects in terms of the development of critical thinking as well.
Well, and I think it also illustrates another one of the principles I want to surface early on, and that is if something is said inaccurately in one venue, it sometimes gets repeated again and again, because some of this curriculum came from a PBS special, and you had on one PBS special, Ted Koppel, for example, saying things like, there are more Muslims in America than there are Jews in America. Well, back when he said it, that wasn't right. It isn't right today. We have still many more Jews in America than we have Muslims in America, and yet it was first said on PBS, then it's repeated in the curriculum, and pretty soon you get the sense that, oh, well, I guess we have at least 5 million Muslims in America. We don't, and that's just a simple one. But I think it illustrates again how if you get an error in one area and it gets repeated a number of times, pretty soon everybody believes that that erroneous information is factual.
Exactly. And what we had to do was we had to trace that fact back to see if we could find any sort of evidence or documentation of it. It was something that sounded wrong to our scholars, but we need to provide the evidence for that. And so we were able to find surveys and census data that confirmed that information was not correct. But like you said, it's been perpetuated and perpetuated, even though there really is no basis for this. And so in the report we have listed citations for the evidence that disproves this fact, which I think can be valuable for others who may also be looking to find evidence to disprove factual inaccuracies.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available, some of their research, and, of course, we'll open up the phones for your comments. All that coming up right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The public schools are becoming more politically correct all the time. On my radio program recently, I read story after story of school administrators working to prevent any controversy. On Constitution Day, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals declined a request for a full hearing on a case involving 4 students in a California high school. They were sent home for wearing American flag T-shirts on Cinco de Mayo. Essentially, the court said that the officials of the high school could censor students who wanted to wear flag emblazoned shirts. Perhaps I should send these judges a copy of the book Supreme Irony. Kelly Shackelford of Liberty Institute wrote the book from his speech at the Historical Society of the Supreme Court. He recounted the famous case of Tinker versus Des Moines, in which the Supreme Court ruled that high school students had the right to wear black armbands protesting the Vietnam War. A number of high school students in South Carolina decided to remember September 11th terrorist attacks by flying American flags on their trucks in the school parking lot. Although the principal said he applauded the students' patriotism, he ordered all the flags removed from the vehicles. Apparently, there is a district policy that bans students from drawing an unusual amount of attention to oneself. The students decided to hold a protest meeting in which they demanded the zero-tolerance policy be changed, and after a Facebook post about the meeting surfaced, a number of people began driving past the school with flags flying on their vehicles. An Army officer went to his daughter's school in Michigan and was greeted by a security guard who told him that he would have to change out of his uniform before he could enter the building. 3 other people at the high school told him the same thing because they feared that his military uniform would offend some students. In this case, the principal later called to apologize for the incident. These are just 3 examples of many that demonstrate how political correctness is taking over our public schools. It's time for citizens to protest and say, enough is enough. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
What are the public schools teaching about the Middle East today? That is certainly a topic that we're going to be focusing on in this first hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Looking at a report that was done by Verity Educate, and Verity Educate is linked on our website. Go to our web links and you can find out more about them. Go to our articles section, that first one, Biased Lessons on Islam. And what we have there is kind of a summary, just a very short summary of kind of an executive summary. But at the bottom there, you can click on something that says request a copy of the full report. So you can read a little of the summary. And I'll certainly go through some of that. But for those of you that have been watching what is happening in the public schools or would like to have full documentation, we do have that available. And again, we want to encourage you to connect up with Dr. Ellen Wald at Verity Educate. And let me just issue 1 or 2 disclaimers. It's always sad that we have to do that. Number 1, I have no problem with us teaching religion in the public schools. But teaching about religion and teaching false ideas about religion are 2 different things. Teaching about religion and encouraging people to accept a particular religion, as we found in our previous studies in this particular middle school curriculum that said you are going to take on a Muslim name, you're going to actually fulfill some of the duties of Islam. That I think goes beyond that. So there's nothing wrong. As a matter of fact, I think schools should teach about religion, because when they don't teach anything about religion, they imply that religion is not important. That's not the issue we have here. What we have here is a fairly significant amount of errors, whether intentional or accidental, a lot of what could be called academic dishonesty, some problematic and even inappropriate origins of some of the curriculum, questions about how they portray Israel and the idea of a one-state solution, as well as some comments about Arabs and Muslims, as well as, I think, a fair amount of bias. Dr. Wald, have I done a good job at least of trying to quickly summarize what is about a 150-page report?
I'm very impressed with your summary. It's quite an extensive report, and you've definitely done it justice.
Let's go into a couple more details, and then we'll open up for some questions people might have. First of all, some of the inaccurate and false information. Maybe you can pick out a few that you thought were so glaring, because if we are continuing to teach kids, teach children, I guess I should say, teach students these ideas, and then we expect them later on to vote for candidates based upon false ideas about the Middle East, or support or not support various attempts to deal with Israel, to deal with ISIS, to deal with Hamas, whatever that might be, I think we are doing a disservice. So what were some of the more glaring examples you found of inaccurate and false information?
Sure. One of those that speaks directly to the topic you brought up is what we saw was almost a consistently referring to terrorist organizations as political groups. So, for example, in several instances, in different handouts in the curricula, Hamas and Hezbollah were referred to as political groups, when in fact they are terrorist organizations. These groups happen to also engage in some political activities, but are primarily terrorist groups and are identified as such by the United States and many other nations. And so this, in effect, does not only contribute to misinformation, but also biases students. And whether the information was conveyed out of bias or out of ignorance or simply out of a lack of familiarity with the material, we don't know. But the end effect of this misinformation is that it gives students a false idea of what Hamas and Hezbollah actually are.
Let's talk about history, because your expertise is history. When you read that in the curriculum that in the early days of Islam, the attempt was simply to spread the word of God, that in the early days of Islam, Muslims rarely used force. They never tried to compel anyone to accept Islam. I just can't even believe some of those statements are in there, but all the way through, we seem to have a complete revisionist history of the first few centuries after the death of Muhammad. What are your thoughts?
Yes, we see this. This is a common error that we see not just in this material, though this material was particularly pronounced, I think, primarily because of the source of the particular material in this case. But we see this in other textbooks, general world history textbooks in both the middle school and high school level. And part of it comes from a problem with generalization. Generalizing about all Muslims in the Middle East is always problematic. And the facts show, and there's been significant historical research on these points, particularly a scholar named Hugh Kennedy has recently written a fantastic book about the Muslim conquests after the death of Muhammad that shows that force was used. And in some cases, in many cases, Muslims did compel enemies to accept Islam. In other cases, they did not. So it's a problem to say that they never did when the historical evidence shows that they did do this.
Sure. You don't want to say always, but you never want to say never, and you see which side it airs on. And that's the point. Every once in a while, certainly, there's an attempt to try to simplify things for a history textbook, or in this case, a curriculum. But when you always err on one side, you start wondering about one of the other issues I wanted to ask you about, and that is the sense of bias. Because obviously, these curricula, and in other cases, these textbook wars that we've had over the years, sometimes people have bias, but when the bias always goes to the liberal or progressive side, or in this case, sometimes the bias always goes towards trying to make Islam's history look better than it is, you've got to at least ask some questions about its academic credibility, don't you?
Precisely. And because in this case some of that material was so pronounced, we were able to, in tracing the material, find out the source of that material and thus reveal the biases.
Yes.
In this case, a lot of that material came from, we traced it to a particular website that is primarily a religious website that espouses all sorts of ideas about Islam that are very negative towards other religions and also towards other sects of Islam. So Islam is not a single unified religion. There are many different branches of it, and it certainly expressed hatred toward other types of Muslims. And this website was really not a credible source of historical information. And that information, that historical information, in turn, we traced to a publication by a religious organization in Los Angeles called the Omar ibn al-Khattab Foundation, which, though it seems fairly mainstream, is a religious organization, not a historical, not a source of objective history, who in turn took this text from a corporate publication by Aramco that was originally written in the 1960s. And that really revealed to us where a lot of these biases were coming from, because the publication was written to tell employees what the corporation wanted them to know about the people that they might be coming into contact with. And so it was written from a very Islamic-centric perspective, with a lot of outdated historical information. And so once you have uncovered that source and that bias, you can see how all of this false information came to be. Whether or not Aramco in the 1960s wants to tell its employees those things about Islam is its business, but that does not make it credible history, and it certainly does not give it a place in a public school.
So I would certainly would agree. When we come back from the break, though, let's also talk about some of the sources, because you found that things were taken from BBC or PBS specials, whatever it might be, but without attribution, and that's always a problem anyway. After all, if this had been written by a student and a teacher discovered that a lot of that had been plagiarized or copied, that student would not get a good grade, to put it mildly. And yet, this is the curriculum that was being used in the school district. So there are some other issues to put on the table, but if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll also talk about the perspective in this Middle East curriculum about Israel and Palestine, and about the Palestinians, and about the Arabs and others. That is a conversation we'll also have with Alan Dershowitz in the second hour today, as we talk about his new book, Terror Tunnels, the Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. But if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Verity Educate, you can go to our website. We have a web link there, and also under our articles section, an executive summary, but also an opportunity for you to get the entire report. Let me just mention that since it's Tuesday, you know what that means. We have another of our uncensored series videos that will be posted tonight. That will be, this newest one is on the subject of abortion. We've covered lots of different issues on voting and many other topics, sex before marriage. But again, this is one that we will be posting on our Facebook page. Of course, you can go already to our YouTube channel and watch it. And our goal, again, is for you to watch the video, then to send it on to the next generation, the millennial generation, and others that might benefit from some of the facts and figures and statistics that are there, with all of the video pictures and other things that you can benefit from. And we certainly do believe that this is a way that we can extend the message and the ministry of Point of View. Let's take a break, though. We'll come back and continue our conversation and take your phone calls. That coming up right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Are we giving accurate information in the public school system today about the Middle East, about Israel, about ISIS, about Hamas, Hezbollah, and certainly about Islam? We'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We have with us for a little bit longer Dr. Ellen Wald, and she is the Executive Director of Verity Educate, I should say. And this is a report that is available to you if you'd like to read a little bit more, as they have done an investigation of the curriculum that was used in one school district. And, of course, we know so well how these various curricula show up in so many other school districts as well. Let's take on two other points, and then I'll see if we can go to some phone calls. The first is the issue of attribution. I already alluded to that, Dr. Wald, a minute ago. If a student quotes from, I don't care, Wikipedia or Aramco or from a textbook without giving any kind of attribution, we generally call that plagiarism. However, if those people that are writing textbooks or actually writing curricula do that, sometimes that's just seen as scholarship. But you had some real concerns about the lack of attribution for some of the things that were actually in this curriculum, didn't you?
We did. The lack of attribution was problematic in the case that I talked about before the break, where students were provided with a handout ostensibly about early Islamic history, but it turned out that that handout was taken from a website that espouses some very hateful ideas and ideology. And so the lack of attribution, there were a lot of problems with the content, and the fact that the source of the material was hidden from students and parents and whoever else was looking at it made it very difficult for them to look at that source and assess it for themselves. But we also saw some even deeper problems, one of which we found in a primary source document. So students were provided with the actual text of the Palestinian National Charter. And in this case, a source was provided, a Yale Avalon Project website, which provides access to a variety of documents. When we went to check that out, we found that the second article from the Palestinian National Charter was missing in the document provided to students, and that all of the article numbers had also been removed so that there was no indication that this article was missing. And while not exactly an issue of plagiarism, it is a very disturbing instance of academic dishonesty, because students were presented with what they were told was the full text of a document, when in fact a very important part of that document was removed. And that article that was removed is actually the article that states that the Palestinian National Charter considers Palestine all of the territory in the original Palestine Mandate, which would seemingly preclude any sort of territorial division or two-state scenario with Israel. And we found that a very problematic instance of academic dishonesty, because it altered the understanding that the students could have and the education of the students in a factually inaccurate way.
Certainly changed their perspective, which gets me to the second point I wanted to ask you about, and that is, we've had a discussion and debate on this program, and certainly this has been an ongoing debate about a so-called two-state solution and all sorts of other issues. But one of the things that you found is the material was all really prejudiced towards the idea of a very radical position. In other words, it tended to make it seem like the only real debate would be whether or not we have a one-state solution with the Palestinians ruling or a two-state scenario with Palestinians ruling. It left out the idea of a two-state solution with Israel or a one-state solution with Israel. And explain that. I know it's a little bit difficult to get in your mind, but you've got a great diagram that as people go to the website or find this article, they'll see how it really shifted the whole perception of where the debate was, and thus helped promote perhaps the most radical position of all.
Yeah, so you've certainly done a good job explaining it. We call this shifting the spectrum. And the material that was provided to students, in this case I'll give one example of it, asked students to consider the idea of a, quote, one-state or two-state solution. Now, by a, quote, one-state solution, the material meant that there would be some sort of unitary state in which Arabs or Palestinians would form the majority of the population. And this idea is not something that really forms any kind of general or mainstream discussion of the subject. It's not even a possibility that the current Palestinian Authority endorses. It's not endorsed by Israel. It's not endorsed by the United States. All of these mainstream bodies endorse what's called a two-state solution, which is where there will be some sort of division of land between Israel and a future Palestinian state. But the educational material presented it in such a way that prejudiced students maybe in favor of a one-state solution, or at the very least presented that scenario as not radical. They presented it as mainstream, when in fact most of the people who are talking about this are really fringe academics or people who are much more on the radical end. And the diagram you mentioned shows it well, how when choosing the information that's presented to students and leaving out important perspectives can change the way students see the spectrum of ideas and lead them to believe that this quote-unquote one-state solution is actually mainstream, when in reality it's not mainstream at all. It's highly radical.
Well, and again, the way the documents treated such groups as Hamas, Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood, were those not problematic as well?
Yes. Well, in many cases, Hamas and Hezbollah were referred to as political organizations, and that's actually something that we see in a variety in other textbooks as well, in geography books and also world history books, incorrectly referring to them as political groups on par with, say, the Palestinian Authority or any other political group, when in fact they are radical terrorist organizations. And this is seen throughout the curriculum in multiple different documents.
Well, let's, if we can, just before I let you go, talk about some of the ways and people can use this. First of all, we already have a link to Verity Educate. And, of course, we have a link to the article, which is kind of a summary, just a brief executive summary, and then you can request a copy of the full report. Explain a little bit more about, first of all, what is available to our listeners, and then second of all, how they might be able to use this, since we do have listeners in the state or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but this doesn't just stay in Massachusetts. These ideas and these curricula and some of the textbooks and other teaching materials show up in almost all sorts of states, so it's important to kind of use your analysis to find out what's going on in their own public school system.
Sure, yes. We, this analysis is specific to this particular curriculum, but has applications far outside that. For example, it can help parents in particular understand what maybe to look for, what kinds of issues can arise. We as an organization do not engage in advocacy. We're an educational organization, so we provide information about the curricula. So if a parent wants to know and wants to understand what is in the educational material that's being provided to their child, they can contact us, and we can, either do an analysis or begin that process and inform them of what's in that curriculum, what information is inaccurate and what information is accurate. Because that's really the first step, is to find out what exactly is in the curriculum. What does the curriculum say? The second step is to refute it with factual evidence from mainstream sources, because if you don't use evidence that comes from mainstream sources and actually go through and refute the misinformation, then I think that people's complaints are easily dismissed. So that's kind of the second step. And I think that this report will be helpful to other people who may be going through similar things in their particular school districts, but also to this can be used to show anyone anyone in a school district or a legislator or anyone else in that position what information is factually inaccurate. A report such as this can be used as evidence.
Well, again, it's a great report, 153 pages, so if people would like to get a copy of it, we have provided a mechanism for them to do so. A report on Middle East curricula, and it is done by Verity Educate. It just came out the 1st of September, and so it's just hot off the press, and we wanted to get that to you as well. Dr. Ellen Wald, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I have a few final comments before we then, in our second hour today, we'll be talking with Alan Dershowitz. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes before we go to our second hour interview with Alan Dershowitz and his new book, Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. But I did want to give you a couple of comments and reflections on what we found in this first hour interview with Dr. Ellen Wald. And if you read through the entire report, you've got to be concerned about the way in which we are teaching about the Middle East today in the public school system. It's not surprising, I would have to say, that a while back when we were doing this interview with Dale Hansen-Burke, she was pointing out that even younger evangelicals perceive Israel differently, and she talked about all sorts of reasons for that, and we even sort of alluded to some of those yesterday. We don't talk about prophecy, and we don't necessarily think of the Jewish people as the chosen people, and on and on and on. But I think there's another element that I would add to her list that she did not have on there, and that is the way the Middle East is taught in the public schools today is not accurate. That's being very nice, actually, because we are, in a sense, dealing with at least two issues. And so let me address each one of those. The first is that if you look through the curriculum, there is an attempt to really soft pedal the history of Israel and of Islam, and to really kind of put it in a way that makes it sort of palatable to American young people without understanding, first of all, the complexities, but also some of the very difficult parts of that history. One of those, which I already mentioned in the previous interview that we did with Dr. Ellen Wald, is this idea that Islam was a peaceful religion and that did not actually use compulsion to force people into Islam, that Islam spread just simply through missionaries, completely ignoring the Islamic army that spread out from the Arab Peninsula and captured so much land in northern Africa all the way into Spain. And if it were not for the defeat of the Muslim army at the hands of Charles Martel, may have taken much of Europe, also going to the east and taking over Persia and a lot of the rest of the Middle East and the so-called Stan countries today. And you can see that that is certainly inaccurate. Also, this idea that, well, every religion has its fundamentalists, and it reminds me of the commentary that I did just a week ago, and even the audio that we played, because it was based upon a comment or two by Bill Maher. And you might remember if you listened to our Friday show when we played it, or if you would like, you can go back to my commentary, which aired last week, September 22nd, because here you had atheist Bill Maher. We don't exactly quote him favorably too often here on this program, but he's on the Charlie Rose PBS show, and he's really making a point, or at least trying to make a point, about how dangerous Islam is, and Charlie Rose is really giving kind of the typical answer that all religions are dangerous, very similar to what you see in some of this curriculum that we just talked about a minute ago with Dr. Ellen Wald. And quite frankly, Bill Maher would have none of it. And if I can quote directly from him, Bill Maher said, you know, vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you leave the Christian religion, you should be killed for it. Vast numbers of Christians do not treat women as second-class citizens. Vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you draw a picture of Jesus Christ, you should be killed for it. And the implication is there's a real difference between radical Islam and Christians. And moreover, when he was challenged by Charlie Rose as to how prevalent those ideas were, Bill Maher quoted from a Pew poll, and he got the numbers pretty close to accurate, but the actual numbers are in my commentary, where we found that 80% believe in Egypt that stoning is an appropriate punishment for adultery. Nearly all of them, 88%, believe that death was an appropriate punishment for leaving the Muslim religion. Think about that. Nearly 9 out of every 10 Egyptians believe that. That is very different than anything you might have. And then he went on to talk about the beheadings and things of that nature. And certainly he says that in Mecca, non-Muslims are not even allowed in the holy parts of the city. You don't have that in other religions. Bill Maher said if there were beheading people in Vatican City, which is the equivalent of Mecca, he said, don't you think there would be a bigger outcry? And so he made a real comment about this idea that what we sometimes have is what he calls the soft bigotry of low expectations with Muslim people. And that phrase surfaced again this last week when we had an individual that beheaded a woman in Oklahoma. Now, this individual took on all sorts of trappings of the Muslim faith, showed solidarity with ISIS, claimed to be a Muslim, had tattoos that showed that he was, and yet the answer that we come back is this is this workplace violence. Well, it is, but it's a whole lot more than that as well. And so always we see sort of this an attempt to apologize or to soften some of those negative aspects. The other part of that, and we're going to get into this more in the second hour, is to basically say, well, there's sort of a moral equivalency between Muslims like Hamas and Jews like those in Israel. And really the solution, as we talked about a minute ago, is the so-called idea of land for peace, which goes back to UN Security Council Resolution 242. Well, we've done that a few times, and one of those is known as Gaza, and Hamas controls that region, and we have seen Gaza actually decimated internally, and we've seen Hamas constantly firing rockets into Israel, and so when Israel finally acts, we see, of course, the condemnation that comes from all sorts of voices around the world. And that's why we're going to be talking with Alan Dershowitz for just a moment about his book and what he actually discovered as he went into those terror tunnels. And as he has become very outspoken in his criticism of some of these reports that have been so critical of Israel and have claimed that Israel is, for example, engaged in war crimes. And so we're going to get into some of that in a lot more detail. But again, when you look at the curriculum, it's pushing more and more young people to say, you know, really the solution is just to have a government in which Palestinians have a majority, they have majority rule, and certainly they'll live peaceably with the Jews. And, of course, we will see very quickly that that is not the goal of Hamas. It's not the goal of Hezbollah. It's not the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is not the goal, of course, of ISIS or other groups like this. And so we're going to spend some time getting into those details and reminding us that, you know, attempts at trying to come up with a peace process have not been very effective. I love what Charles Crutchhammer said. You know, some geopolitical conflicts are morally complicated, but the Israeli-Gaza war is not. It possesses a moral clarity not only rare, but excruciating. And again, we've talked about how, in some respects, Benjamin Netanyahu's famous line illustrates that only so well, because they use their missiles, their rockets and missiles, to protect their citizens, but Hamas uses their citizens to protect their rockets. Or we can look back, even back as far as almost a year ago, when they actually called the cell phones and left cell phone messages on those in Gaza about the fact that they should leave their homes or places where there might be militants, because if they had an incursion, they wanted to work as hard as they possibly could to eliminate any kind of collateral damage, any kind of civilian casualties, whereas Hamas seems dedicated to increase the number of civilian casualties. We'll talk more about that in just a minute with Alan Dershowitz, but let me encourage you to visit the website today, pointofview.net. That first article is going to give you information that you can find from the work that was done by this particular group called Verity Educate, and Dr. Ellen Wald was with us. Second article is going to give you a summary of the book that we're going to be talking about with Alan Dershowitz, and we have it in our Point of View store today, so you can order it there as well, and we have links both to Verity Educate as well as to Alan Dershowitz. But as you go to the website, you might also make sure that tonight you click on that button that says Facebook, or just go directly to Point of View Radio Talk Show at Facebook, because we will release again our latest in a series of uncensored videos, this one on the subject of abortion. And of course, we fought the battle against abortion since 1973. 60 million babies have been aborted since then. We've lost an entire generation. And the question we need to ask is, how long will this continue to go on, and how many more generations will we lose? Certainly one of the great challenges we face is to come up with good, concrete ways to make the case for life. And I think you will appreciate the video. I encourage you to take the time to watch it and then pass it on to others, perhaps even abortion-minded individuals you might know. But most importantly, we want to take some of the things that we talk about here on Point of View and give you an opportunity to pass them on to your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, and family members. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk with Alan Dershowitz and focus on what is happening in Israel. All that coming up right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, as we continue some of the conversation we even had in the first hour about Israel and Hamas, and we have an opportunity now to bring a distinguished guest to the program. Professor Alan Dershowitz is an individual that has served on the faculty at Harvard Law School for so very many years. Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard University, graduate of Brooklyn College, Harvard Law School, published more than 1,000 different articles in magazines, newspapers, journals, and blogs, author of more than 30 fiction and nonfiction books, at least 6 of which national bestsellers. And we've talked in the past about, for example, books like The Case for Israel, and this one, Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. We have a summary about it in our articles section. We also have an opportunity for you, if you'd like to order it, through the Point of View store. It is an ebook, and I would encourage you to get it, put it on your Kindle, and read through it. And Professor Dershowitz, a delight to have you on the program with us today.
Well, thank you so much. You know, this is my first ebook. I've done 31 other hardcover books, but this one, I finished it like 2 weeks ago, and it was already an Amazon bestseller 2 days later. It's amazing what technology allows you to do in terms of bringing issues to the forefront in real time immediately. So I'm really, really happy with this book.
Our guest first hour had a kind of an ebook, which is more of a summary. And of course, I know Ben Carson had a latest ebook, and you have as well. And that's what I love about it, because I'm going to get right into it, because I don't want to waste anybody's time. You start out by talking about having been able to go into one of those tunnels and to really see what was there. And I might tell our listeners, we're not only going to be talking about the tunnels, but we're going to talk about Israel, Hamas. We're going to talk about myths. Might go back to some of the writing you've done a couple of years ago on the Goldstone Report and issues of war crimes. But tell us what you found as you went into that tunnel. Give us the eyes and ears look at what you found.
It was remarkable. I have a friend in Israel who was a top gun in the U.S. Air Force, and then his family moved to Israel, and he moved with them and became a top gun in the Israeli Air Force, working very closely with the American Air Force. He was one of the people who was part of the planning for the attack on the nuclear reactor in Iraq. An amazing guy. And he said to me when I came to Israel, do you want to see the tunnels? I said, what tunnels? He said, you remember Gilad Shalit was kidnapped through a tunnel? He said, Israel's just found a new tunnel, and it's just yards away from a kindergarten with 57 children in it, and it was designed just to allow Hamas death squads to come up and kill and kidnap the children. I said, sure. I went down and saw the tunnels. They were absolutely amazing. They were architectural marvels. They were made out of hard concrete. They had electric lines going through them. They had material to keep explosives. They had communication. They had air filters. And they cost $3 million each to build. They used child labor. 162 Palestinian children died in the process of building these. Dozens more were executed. What happened is they would take them down to build the tunnels, then they'd kill them because they didn't want them to reveal to Israel where the tunnels were. These are really tunnels of death.
Yes.
And about a week later, 4 or 5 days later, I had dinner at the home of Benjamin Netanyahu, just with him and his wife, and I told him I had been in the tunnels. He knew about the tunnels, of course, but he had not been in them as far as I know. And we talked a lot about that. And I was with him again yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he spoke at the General Assembly of the United Nations. And again, we talked about the tunnels. In fact, he used my title, Terror Tunnels, twice in his talk at the UN. And as soon as I saw these tunnels, I realized Israel would have no choice. Would any country allow tunnels to be built under their land to come up on kindergartens and hospitals and schools and synagogues? The word was that the Hamas was planning a massive terror attack on the Jewish New Year on Rosh Hashanah, which we just celebrated last week. And they were going to send hundreds of fighters up and kill people at prayer. Can you imagine killing people at prayer on the holiest day of the year? Of course, Israel was attacked on Yom Kippur in 1973, so nothing when it comes to Israel should surprise anybody.
Yeah, 1973, Yom Kippur. And again, we were just thinking about Rosh Hashanah because that's what they were saying. And we're actually taking a group, at least some of our listeners and myself, will be in Israel at the end of October, which, by the way, I might just say, Alan Dershowitz, it was a little hard to get people to come when all the rockets were landing at that time, although I think because of this, it probably has made it safer. But to think about the fact that all those young people were pressed into work, also many of them killed, but also to think of how that concrete could have been used to enhance Gaza, could have been...
It was supposed to have been used.
Yes,
it was given by many of the European donor nations, and all the money that was given to Gaza was used by Hamas to build rockets and also to enrich themselves. There's a real kleptocracy there at the very top. There are luxury apartments, luxury hotels. A lot of the people from the leaders of Hamas have gotten rich, while the average person in Gaza is not well off. And they used all the resources to build these tunnels and to build rockets, and they build the rocket launchers right next to UN headquarters, hospitals. There's a French film, a video that was taken by a French journalist that shows a Hamas fighter putting a rocket right next to a UN school. Then he himself runs underground to one of the tunnels to hide. But you can see children playing right around the area where the rocket was launched from. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu showed that yesterday at the UN, the photograph of the rocket launchers right next to children. So they use what I call, it's a terrible term, but it's unfortunately accurate, the dead baby strategy. They want Israel to kill their children. It's horrible. As Golda Meir once said, we can forgive you perhaps for killing our children, but we can never forgive you for making us kill your children. And that's their tactic, and they know that Israelis don't want to kill Palestinian children. But if they do, they are ready, the Hamas, to hold up the children in front of the media and use them as displays to invoke the dead baby strategy. And then the media thoughtlessly just blames Israel. I'll give you an example. If somebody goes and robs a bank with a gun and the police come, and he grabs a kid and holds him as a hostage and starts shooting at the police and at customers, and the policeman, in an effort to avoid hitting the child hostage, takes careful aim, but the hostage taker lifts the child up suddenly, and the child is killed by a policeman's bullet. Who's responsible? Not the policeman, but the person who took the hostage. And I submit, and I argue in my book, Terror Tunnels, that every single death caused by Hamas's use of human shields is a death attributable to Hamas, not to Israel. And yet the media, the international community, the hard-left lawyers, they all blame Israel for these deaths, and that's exactly Hamas's goal. And that's why they'll repeat it over and over and over again. And two of the villains of this piece are Jimmy Carter, who has become a cheerleader for Hamas, and Bishop Desmond Tutu, who has become a cheerleader for Hamas. Have they read the Hamas Charter? The Hamas Charter says that everybody who supports Israel, including Americans, should be killed. Every Jew hiding behind every rock should be killed. They want a caliphate. They want to convert everybody in the world to their brand of Islam. And they work hand in hand with other extremist groups like ISIS and Hezbollah and Iran. And as Prime Minister Netanyahu said yesterday, it's really one organized threat. It's Islamic radicalism that is trying to destroy Christianity, Judaism, the West, and impose their own religious caliphate on the entire world. And that's why Israel is fighting not only for its own survival, but for the survival of Western democracy, Christianity, Judaism, and all other faiths other than the ones that the caliphate would represent and tolerate.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation with Alan Dershowitz. The book is entitled Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. About 230 pages. You can get it instantaneously as you go to the website here. Come back, we'll talk a little bit more about more than just the dead baby strategy, but the blame Israel first kind of mindset. All that coming up right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The public schools are becoming more politically correct all the time. On my radio program recently, I read story after story of school administrators working to prevent any controversy. On Constitution Day, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals declined a request for a full hearing on a case involving 4 students in a California high school. They were sent home for wearing American flag T-shirts on Cinco de Mayo. Essentially, the court said that the officials of the high school could censor students who wanted to wear flag emblazoned shirts. Perhaps I should send these judges a copy of the book Supreme Irony. Kelly Shackelford of Liberty Institute wrote the book from his speech at the Historical Society of the Supreme Court. He recounted the famous case of Tinker versus Des Moines, in which the Supreme Court ruled that high school students had the right to wear black armbands protesting the Vietnam War. A number of high school students in South Carolina decided to remember September 11th terrorist attacks by flying American flags on their trucks in the school parking lot. Although the principal said he applauded the students' patriotism, he ordered all the flags removed from the vehicles. Apparently, there is a district policy that bans students from drawing an unusual amount of attention to oneself. The students decided to hold a protest meeting in which they demanded the zero-tolerance policy be changed, and after a Facebook post about the meeting surfaced, a number of people began driving past the school with flags flying on their vehicles. An Army officer went to his daughter's school in Michigan and was greeted by a security guard who told him that he would have to change out of his uniform before he could enter the building. 3 other people at the high school told him the same thing because they feared that his military uniform would offend some students. In this case, the principal later called to apologize for the incident. These are just 3 examples of many that demonstrate how political correctness is taking over our public schools. It's time for citizens to protest and say, enough is enough. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
New book out by Alan Dershowitz. Again, it's entitled Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. 230 pages. It's an ebook. You can get it instantaneously. Go to our website or go to Amazon. You can find it there. And we were talking about the difference between Israel and Hamas. Professor Dershowitz, you're very familiar with the famous quote by Benjamin Netanyahu when he compared the Air Dome and the Iron Dome, where he said, we're using missile defense to protect our citizens. They're using their civilians to protect their missiles. What a contrast.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And in my previous book called The Case for Moral Clarity, I actually have a cartoon on the front cover showing an Israeli soldier protecting a baby in a baby carriage and firing at Hamas soldier who was using the baby in the baby carriage to protect himself. And that's really, in a nutshell, what the difference is. The other difference, and Benjamin Netanyahu put it very well, as he always does, he said that if Hamas were to lay down its arms, there would be immediate peace.
Yes.
If Israel were to lay down its arms, there would be genocide. And we all know that. We all know that if Israel were not the strongest country in the Middle East, they would try to do what they did in 1960s, well, before that even, 1929, when they killed Jews at prayer in Hebron, in the 1930s when they murdered Jews, in the 1948 when Israel declared independence and they killed 1% of the Israeli population, in 1967 when they were planning a genocidal war, in 1973 when they attacked on Yom Kippur. Israel is always fighting for its life, and it can't afford ever to lose once. Hamas can lose over and over again. It comes back, it builds new tunnels, it builds new rockets, it loses the war on the ground, it causes the death of 1,000 civilians, and then it wins with reports of the United Nations, with condemnations, with hard left lawyers, with academic boycotts, the boycott, sanction, divest movement, with criticism and condemnation by the Obama administration, which, to its everlasting discredit, said that Israel could do better in avoiding civilian casualties. Well, Israel has done much better than the NATO forces fighting wars around the world. The NATO forces in the United States have approximately a ratio of 4 civilians killed to every terrorist killed. And Israel has a ratio of approximately 1 to 1 during wartime, and a much better ratio when they use targeted attacks when in reprisal of attacks made on Israel. So, you know, for the United States to be lecturing Israel, saying it could do better, how could it do better? What would it do? Should it not go after the tunnels? Should it allow the rockets to attack and just rely on the Iron Dome, which is only 85% effective? And the reason so many Palestinians die and so few Israeli civilians die, Israel has spent a fortune of money building shelters. Every Israeli is within 30 seconds of a shelter, whereas Hamas only has shelters for its fighters, not for its civilians. And Israel has the Iron Dome, and Hamas uses all of its resources to attack Israel. So, you know, there are explanations, but the media doesn't show them. It just shows dead babies, mothers grieving over their dead babies. Palestinian mothers love their babies as much as Israeli mothers do, but, you know, the leaders of Hamas don't.
Well, part of that dead baby strategy, again, talking about the book Terror Tunnels, Alan Dershowitz with us. Speak to the issue that only occasionally comes up on this program, and that is the idea that this might be a country that should be prosecuted for war crimes, because you have a couple of chapters. A lot of those go back 4 years to the Goldstone report. But frankly, most of our listeners tend to be listening on Christian stations, very supportive of the nation of Israel. But I'll be honest, at least once a month, I'll get someone say, you know, I think Israel should be brought to The Hague for war crimes. How would you respond to a comment like that?
Well, Israel does more than any other country to comply with the rule of law. There's a joke in Israel that when they first got Phantom jets, there was just room for one pilot. Then with the sophisticated mechanisms, they had a pilot and a navigator. Now they have 3-seat planes, a pilot, a navigator, and a lawyer. And everything Israel does is within the rule of law. They, unlike the United States, their judge-advocate rules are final. So if the judge-advocate rules that a particular target is not an appropriate target, they can't be overruled by the military. In the United States, it's just advisory, although the United States does always listen to its judge-advocate corps, but legally it's only advisory. So I don't think any country in the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel has ever had a better record of complying with the rule of law. And if it were to be brought in front of the International Criminal Court, instead of Russia for what it did in Ukraine and in Chechnya, instead of Cuba for the way it treats its dissidents, China the way it treats the Tibetans, and many, many other countries in the world, it would say more about the International Criminal Court than it would about Israel, and it would mean that forever the United States would never, ever be willing to join that court because it wouldn't be a real court. So far, they have not accepted jurisdiction over Israel, and you know, you would expect that they would accept jurisdiction over Hamas. Hamas is the one who commits the double war crimes. It fires at civilians from civilian shield areas, and it uses tunnels, which is a war crime, to attack civilians, and it treats its prisoners not as prisoners of war, but as hostages. And so if anybody is to be brought in front of the International Criminal Court, it should be Hamas, but not Israel.
What about the way in which Operation Protective Edge and others were conducted? Did you feel good? Because obviously you're making the case for the idea of a just war, but even in a just war, sometimes there are abuses. What are your...
Well, no war has ever been fought without there being some abuses, of course. Individual soldiers, these are 18 and 19-year-old kids, inexperienced. Inevitably, you're going to find some people who overreact. You don't judge a country by what an 18-year-old soldier does. You judge it by how it then judges what the 18-year-old soldier does. And Israel has held its soldiers accountable for any violations. My friend, the same friend who took me into the tunnel, once aborted an attack on a terrorist camp in Lebanon because he saw a child in the area. And, you know, that was a very expensive thing to do, to abort a well-planned attack. But he saw a child, and he refused to fire, even though there were terrorists in the area. And Israel has developed a technique now where they can fire rockets, and at the last second, if they see a child, they can divert the rocket into the ocean. And they've done that on many, many occasions, and they've avoided hitting legitimate military targets if they believe that there might be civilians in the area. But inevitably, civilians do die. And, of course, the concept of just war, which was articulated by Aquinas and many others, has two elements. One, the justice of fighting the war, and second, the way in which the war is fought. And Israel, of course, had a complete justification for this war. They didn't want to fight it. They didn't want to go in on boots on the ground in the tunnels. I was with Netanyahu when he said, remember, Bibi Netanyahu's brother died leading the rescue at Entebbe. He knows what it feels like to lose a family member, a soldier. The last thing he wanted to do was send Israeli soldiers into harm's way and lose 60-some-odd as he did. But once he saw the tunnels were being used to attack children in kindergartens, he had no choice. And the only way of stopping the tunnels, because nobody knows where the exits are, is to go in and find them on the ground and destroy them. And most of the casualties occurred after Israel accepted the ceasefires. Hamas refused to accept the ceasefires. Hamas continued to fire the rockets and continued to use the tunnels, and that's when most of the casualties occurred. So, again, Hamas is to blame. They didn't accept the ceasefires. Israel did.
Yes. And again, back to that idea of just war, which we've talked about on this program before, the idea of a just cause and a just intention, last resort and things of that nature. But then when you fight it, actually, the issue of proportionality and limiting collateral damage. And it seems to me that despite the way the press sometimes has covered the military engagement, I think Israel's gone beyond what most other countries, other than maybe the United States, have done in terms of trying to prevent any kind of collateral damage. But if you're going to go in, you know that sooner or later bullets and rockets are going to stray and hit some individuals that you did not intend to kill.
Right, and we're seeing that now. The United States, tragically, or our allies, hit a silo the other day going after ISIS.
Yes.
We're going to see more and more of that, and it's inevitable because ISIS is beginning to use human shields too, and many people misunderstand proportionality. Proportionality doesn't mean that the same number of Israelis have to be killed as Palestinians. My God, if we insisted that the same number of policemen be killed as criminals, that would be absurd. What proportionality means is once you've selected a military target, say the tunnels or say the rocket launchers, you have to assess what the likelihood of civilian casualties there. And the value of the military target has to be proportional to the number of expected civilian casualties, including deaths. And Israel has certainly complied with that rule. The other rule that's very important in their international law, and I explain this all in simple terms in my book, Terror Tunnels, is the rule of distinction. You have to distinguish between civilian and military targets. Sometimes that's very hard. The United States, in the first days of the ISIS war, attacked the electronic grid. Now, that's a mixed use. It's mixed use for civilian purposes, but it's also used for communication purposes. Israel did the same thing, and they were criticized for it. But when you're dealing with sophisticated enemies that use rockets and tunnels, the electronic grid is a very important method of communication that every army attacks among its first military targets. So Israel complies with the laws of distinction, distinguishing between military and civilian targets.
Let's take a break. When we come back, let's open up the phones and give you a chance to ask a question or to make a comment. 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us a little bit longer Alan Dershowitz, again, who is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and he has published so many different books, more than 30 different fiction and nonfiction books. This is an ebook, very easy to get. You can go online and find it. We also have a link to it on our website and a link also to his website if you'd like to know a little bit more, but perhaps you have some comments or questions about the military engagements that have taken place between Israel and Hamas. And also we have a few other comments to make about what is happening right now in the Middle East. So if you'd like to join that conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Come back and talk about how sometimes Hamas uses things like the ceasefire for nefarious purposes, the issue of land for peace, and that hasn't worked out so well, and much more. But if you'd like to join our conversation, we welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Pleased to have with us Alan Dershowitz, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Calls coming in. We'll get to those in just a minute. But Professor Dershowitz, I wanted to get to at least one other issue, because there were lots of insights in the various essays in your book, and one of those was the idea that Hamas used ceasefire to kidnap. Hadn't crossed my mind. I mean, a lot of us wondered, well, why did they agree to a ceasefire? And I was thinking, well, maybe they were pressured, maybe they just wanted to reload. You had a different idea, and that is to find a way to kidnap an Israeli soldier or something in order to use extortion to get some of their demands met.
Mm-hmm. No, that's exactly what happened. Everybody was shocked when they finally did accept that ceasefire, but then just hours into the ceasefire, when Israeli soldiers were allowed to go into the tunnels to find them and destroy them under the terms of the ceasefire, they tried to kidnap 3 soldiers. They killed 2 of them. And the third one appeared to have been kidnapped, but forensic tests done by the Israelis demonstrated that almost certainly he was killed, and they just took his body, pretending that they had him alive, and they were going to try to hold him as ransom. And Israel used what's called Operation Hannibal, which is a very tough operation. Israel doesn't want any of its soldiers to be kidnapped because they know that the Israelis so love their children and their soldiers, they'll do anything to get them back. So they used a lot of firepower in order to try to get the kidnappers. And some of the civilians who were killed in this Operation Hannibal, and Israel is now looking into it, whether it was, in fact, an overreaction. You can understand why they would do it. The last thing they want is for there to be people being held as ransom. One of the reasons that Israel initially didn't want women to fly as Air Force pilots was because they realized that the value of a woman in captivity was even greater than the value of a man. But the women brought a lawsuit and they won, and now 8 women, I think, are flying in the Israeli Air Force combat missions and doing extraordinarily well as combat fighters. Unfortunately, none of them have been shot down or captured, but you know that could happen someday.
Certainly could. Let's take some phone calls here, and we'll go first to Michael in Alaska. Michael, thank you for calling today. You're on with Alan Dershowitz.
Taking my call. Kerby, one thing, a note to you, I'd really like to have a whole program addressed to what my question is going to be. And Professor Dershowitz, thank you for taking the question.
Oh, sure.
I'm going to preface it just a little, and that is, why not cut off the head of the serpent, which means why is this funding unregulated by the United States helping the enemy? I don't get this, but more directly, I also don't understand when I look at our foreign policy over the decades, when we have favored Saudi Arabia to such a degree, I don't get it why that they have this leverage over us continually, because we have enough resources in Alaska alone, not counting, Pennsylvania, South Dakota. I mean, in terms of petroleum, I just don't understand why we kowtow continuously to Saudi Arabia, and they fund the enemy, and we fund the enemy of Israel. I don't get this.
It's a very good question. Of course, Saudi Arabia is not even really a country. It's a wholly owned family gas station. I mean, it doesn't have any elements of a country. It's a family. They have a lot of oil and gas, and they use the oil and gas to bring in slave labor, basically. There's no democracy. They behead people for crimes like blasphemy. They will not allow Christians to openly wear a cross or to practice their religion openly. Why we support them? Simply because they have enormous influence in American politics. You know, somebody wrote a book a few years ago called The Israel Lobby, and it was a fake book because Israel doesn't need a lobby. Americans support Israel. Americans deep down know that Israel is just like America in many ways. But why do the administration support Saudi Arabia? They need a lobby. And that's a tough lobbying job, to persuade the American administration to support a country that holds slaves, a country that, I'll tell you a funny, interesting anecdote. When I was 16 years old, I came to Washington for the first time, and it was Lincoln's birthday. And I was at the Lincoln Monument, and just that week, the king of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, happened to be in town, and they put the green flags of Saudi Arabia on the Lincoln Monument. It got me so upset that I tore down a flag. the idea that slave owners should have a flag on the Lincoln Monument, Lincoln to freed the slaves. And I got arrested by the Park Service. And I told them I was thinking about going to law school, so they, of course, didn't really arrest me. They dropped the charges. But my first act of civil disobedience as a young man was to rip down a Saudi Arabian flag on the Lincoln Monument. I think I'd do it again today.
I think there'd be people in the listening audience that would follow you, too.
Yeah, but I think you're right. We have to ask the question. And we are. You know, there was a very interesting case just last week decided in the federal courts in New York where a Jordanian bank, which was helping to fund Hamas terrorism, was held liable. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. We have to go after the sources of funding. And Qatar is funding Hamas. Saudi Arabia, we know, funded Wahhabi extremists, probably including some who brought down the Twin Towers on 9/11. And we have to be, you know, the United States has only one ally in the Middle East that it can count on, and that's Israel. We know 100 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, no matter who's elected in Israel, Israel is always going to be an ally of the United States. They're always going to supply intelligence, always going to supply technical assistance, always going to be a completely reliable ally. Do we know that about Jordan? Do we know that about Egypt? Do we know that about Turkey? Do we know that about Saudi Arabia? We have to maintain a close relationship with the only democracy which has religious freedom in the Middle East, and that's Israel.
Might just mention, Michael, that Chapter 30 in his book that we're just talking about here talks about Qatar and other American, quote, allies are among the villains in Gaza. So you might want to read that and get some more. Let's go to Avi in the state of Texas. Avi, you're on with Alan Dershowitz.
Hey, Avi, I want to tell you something before you ask your question. I was born Avi. My Hebrew name is Abraham, and I was called Avi until I was 20 years old when my parents said, you know, you need a real name to go to college, so they picked Alan out of a hat. But I was Avi until I was 20 years old.
Well, Avi talking to the former Avi, now Alan. Avi, go ahead.
Alan, Shana Tova,
Happy New Year, Happy New Year, Happy New Year to everybody. I don't care if you're Jewish or not. You should all have a good New Year. Good.
Amen. To Jews, to Christians, to even Muslims that wants to live. And not...
Absolutely.
Now, my question to you, what we need the UN? That you have Turkey there and Qatar. They are part of the UN too. Not Qatar, but Turkey. What we need the UN
for? Turkey is not only part of the UN. Turkey is part of NATO. Believe it or not, we share intelligence with NATO, with Turkey, and they're not helping us. They won't allow us to land over.
They want to stab America.
Yeah. Well, one last comment. Avi, what did you have another question? I think you were just really asking the broader question. Why do we have the United Nations judging Israel?
It's
all
amazing.
All the time.
I'm sitting here I'm in New York now, and I'm overlooking the UN. I was in the UN yesterday and listening to Prime Minister Netanyahu and looking at some of these tyrannical countries sitting in judgment over Israel. Cuba telling Israel what to do, China telling Israel what to do, Putin telling Israel what to do. It's just remarkable, the hypocrisy of Israel being judged by nations which have no conception of the rule of law or human rights.
Just before we take a break again, I thought it might be helpful, since we've been talking about ISIS, or the president likes to say ISIL, you have made the case that ISIS is to America what Hamas is to Israel,
Absolutely.
And we should not be surprised by the brutality of ISIS. Explain that, if you might.
Well, ISIS is part of the same claim to an international caliphate. Their religious principles say that they can do anything to convert people to their brand of Islam. And although ISIS and Hamas and Hezbollah have different immediate targets, as Netanyahu pointed out at the UN yesterday, their ultimate targets are the same, as well as Iran's ultimate target. They also expect there to be a caliphate. And Netanyahu quoted extensively from the charter of Hamas, from Iran's charter, from the statements of ISIS, and they all have the same goal: to give us the choice to convert or die. And that's their ultimate goal, and we have to stop them where they are and not allow them to come to our shores, either through lone wolf terrorism or through more organized terrorism, because that's what they're planning.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. Real quickly, might not have time for all the calls, but if you'd like to try to slip in a call, 1-800-351-1212. Talking today with Alan Dershowitz for just a few more minutes, and as we have mentioned before, this book, Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. He's published all sorts of print books, but this is an e-book, which means you can get it instantaneously. You can read it, and of course, one of the things I love about these e-books is they're up to date. that is already, he is commenting on things that have just happened, and also you'll have a chance to go back and see some of the things he's written as late as 4 years ago on some of these topics. And we've talked a little bit about Israel and Hamas. We've talked a little bit about this issue of war crimes. We've talked about the way in which the media covers that and the way in which Hamas has used this, what we call the dead baby strategy, and also, of course, the funding of Hamas and the need for us to reevaluate who our friends are and how this funding takes place. So lots of material in this book, and I think you will really find it very helpful. 230 pages, and it's available on our website. Of course, you can find it out there on the websites as well, but we've made it very easy for you to find. We have a nice summary of it in our article section. We have a link to Alan Dershowitz's website in our web link section. And of course, we have in our Point of View store his book, because we think it gives you a very good look at what has been happening in the battle between Israel and Hamas. We've also talked about the battle between the West and ISIS. We'll talk more about that with you right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back with Alan Dershowitz for just another few minutes, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Charles Krauthammer says that some geopolitical conflicts are morally complicated, but the Israel because a war is not. It possesses a moral clarity, not only rare, but excruciatingly clear. It is a good example of what indeed happens when sometimes people use this idea of moral equivalence in the wrong way. Let's take some phone calls and see if we can give you a chance to ask a question or make a comment, and we'll head to KJNP. Lady, thank you for calling today.
Well, thank you for taking my call. I have a couple of things to say. You were talking about the dates that they've been attacking Israel. Well, the people got to realize that October the 4th is going to be the Day of Atonement. And October the 8th, when they got that red blood moon, is going to be the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'd also like to say that I wonder, like how Methuselah was before the flood, I wonder if Billy Graham ain't our Methuselah, and we need to pray for Billy Graham.
Well, I appreciate that.
I like Billy Graham. I actually went to see him when I was about, 18 or 19 years old. I was a college student, and he was doing his meeting at Madison Square Garden, and my whole group, all Jewish kids from Brooklyn. But we loved a good orator, and we went to see him, and we just marveled at his ability. And I'm a big fan of the Christian Bible. I teach it, actually. I teach a course at Harvard Law School called The Scriptural Sources of Justice, where I assign my students not only the Jewish Bible, the 5 books of Moses, but the Christian Bible, and we look at how conceptions of justice emerge from biblical sources. In fact, I'm writing a new book on Abraham, who was in many ways the father of the 3 Abrahamic monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I use Abraham as a way of thinking about lawyers, because Abraham argued with God over the sinners of Saddam, and Moses argued with God over those who worship the false idol, and of course Jesus argued with the Pharisees. And the idea of argumentation and logic and the ability to question is such an important part of biblical heritage. When I have law students in my class who have a biblical background, I know that they're going to start with a real advantage in the classroom because they understand argumentation, they understand logic, and they come to the problem with a real strong moral base. It's not surprising that one of the best students I had at Harvard Law School was Ted Cruz, Senator from Texas, who was a brilliant student and obviously a deeply thoughtful person about both religion and governance.
I appreciate you teaching that way because, those of us that have had graduate education, we took classes in things like jurisprudence. I had classes in Christian and medieval political theory and things of that nature. We've lost a lot of that today. We do the technical aspects of law, but we don't go back to some of the historical roots, and I think we've missed a great deal. So
I agree. Look, I can't teach the law of self-defense without reading Aquinas. He talks about just killings and just wars.
Summa Theologica,
and I can't teach about the use of preemptive attacks without teaching Maimonides. And I tell my students, we're so lucky. We live in a world where we not only can learn from Blackstone and Cardoza and John Marshall, but we can go back in history and learn from the greatest theological thinkers of the, from the beginning of time. And when you combine all those together, you then have the right to pick and choose which you find persuasive and which not. But at least expose yourself to the arguments of the ages is what I tell my students. And then if you want to be a modernist or a postmodernist, at least you're doing it based on full education, not based on, I only know this, so it must be right.
I'm all about that, reading deeply and widely, and so certainly that's one of the things we encourage our listeners to do as well. Just before I let you go, though, I've got, at least since you're right across from the United Nations there, talk about the UN Security Council Resolution 242, or the idea of land for peace. That just hasn't seemed to work out very well for Israel,
not very well. So far, Israel has given up land for rockets.
Yes.
And I played a very tiny role in drafting 242. I had been Justice Goldberg's law clerk, and he was then at the UN, and he asked me to come down and meet with him at the Waldorf Astoria where he was living, and we went over some of the language of 242, and the big issue was whether Israel should return all the territory in exchange for peace. By the way, they've never gotten peace, so they don't have to give up an inch of land under 242. But in exchange for full peace, full recognition, and secure borders. And Goldberg and the head of the British delegation fought very hard against the use of the word all territories. and they compromised on the word territories, which means that Israel could hold on to some of the territories. But Israel is prepared to give back the vast majority of the West Bank. In 2001, they offered 97% of the West Bank back in exchange for peace, and they got instead an intifada from Arafat, by the way, encouraged by Jimmy Carter, who told Arafat not to accept that offer. And then in 2008, Ehud Olmert offered the Palestinians even more, and the Palestinians rejected it. And now, just the other day, Abbas went to the UN and said he's not going to sit down and have even any discussions with Israel about land for peace unless Israel is prepared right at the beginning to indicate that it will go back to the 67 lines, which it never will.
Never will.
Those are what Avi even called the Auschwitz lines. Those were lines where Israel is separated from potentially ISIS by 8 miles. I mean, the distance between the tip of Manhattan and where I'm living now. You can't do that. And so there has to be compromises, but there have to be compromises consistent with Israel's security. As Netanyahu said yesterday, he will never make a decision that in any way undercuts Israel's security. It's in a bad neighborhood. It's surrounded by enemies, sworn to its destruction, and it must maintain as a priority Israel's security, and I'm glad he's doing that.
Well, I certainly appreciate you taking the time to educate us on this and certainly reinforce some of the ideas that we already have, but to learn some very new ideas that are in your book as well. 230 pages, Terror Tunnels. And again, you're encouraging people to go out and put it on their Kindle and read it right away.
I appreciate that, and great questions from you. I really enjoyed this. This was like a Socratic dialogue, so you're a great talk show host, and I appreciate your having me on your show.
Well, I want to do that again if we can, because we certainly do appreciate the life of the mind and appreciate the interchange of ideas, and I cannot say enough positive about this book. It's got some great insights in here that I haven't seen elsewhere, and so let me commend it to all of our listeners. And Professor Alan Dershowitz, thanks for joining us. We'll do it again sometime.
Thanks. Take care. Be well.
Okay. Just before we go, let me just mention that we have quite a number of resources that we have posted on the website here today. The first, of course, is this book, Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. 230 pages. It is an ebook, and I think it will give you a good opportunity to understand what we are talking about here. And as we talked about just a minute ago, the Security Council Resolution 242 was the idea of land for peace. We've seen how that's worked. It worked somewhat well when, of course, Israel decided to give back some of the land to Egypt that had been taken in the previous war. We see how poorly it has worked as Gaza has been dominated by Hamas, and how we have seen thousands and thousands of rockets shot from the Gaza Strip into Israel. And we have seen what has, of course, unfolded in Operation Protective Edge, and, of course, the building of all of these tunnels. And we've learned, I think, a lot more about what a incredibly evil organization Hamas is, in which they would actually allow these children to work in the building of these tunnels. Then those that survived oftentimes would kill them so no one would know where they are. This is concrete that could have been used to build roads, to build hospitals, to build schools, to have done all sorts of positive things, and instead were used so that they could have a Rosh Hashanah massacre, which fortunately did not take place. So I think you will learn a great deal about that, not only from this interview, from the book. And so let me again encourage you to find out more on our website, pointofview.net. We also have a link to Alan Dershowitz. And don't forget that as you go to our website, you have a chance to click on our Facebook page, and you can see some of the videos that we've posted there, or you can go right to YouTube, because we have a link to YouTube there as well. And I hope that you'll take the time to watch those videos, pass them on to your friends, neighbors, and coworkers. And if you don't already receive some of the emails we send out, I hope you might click on that button that says Get Involved. It's a place for you to then just check various boxes. You can receive my daily commentary. You can receive our show threads, which gives you a preview of what we're going to talk about, gives you all sorts of links, and certainly a way we can communicate with you. So I hope that you will visit the website, pointofview.net, watch the videos, pass them on to others, read some of the articles, hit the share button, and put them on your Facebook page and educate others. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. I'll see you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.